This is the Chapter 1 outline for AP US History. It's called The Collision of Cultures. So America and both American continents, North and South, were known as the New World, and America was first inhabited by Siberians who traveled on the Bering Strait land bridge during the Ice Age from Russia to Alaska. They're known as the Paleo-Indians. They moved south because they were following animals. They fanned out across North and South America as nomads. And there's some evidence of even earlier inhabitants of America, and they were Asian or Southwestern European. Pre-Columbian Indian civilizations. There were 10 million Americans, or like Indians, when Columbus came to the U.S., or to America. There were 400 languages, and there's an extensive Indian trading network. Indians would sometimes exploit the environment, and the book stresses that. It says that they didn't always live in harmony and whatnot. Early cultures, the Indians started making villages when there were no large animals left, and the Indians were pretty advanced. They had inventions like fiber snares, baskets, they had mills for grinding nuts, and they had domesticated turkeys and dogs. They had some farms, they sometimes fished, they hunted elusive animals like deer, elk, and moose, and all those like big things. And the Mexican Highland Indians were growing corn, beans, squash, chili peppers, avocados, and pumpkins, so that kind of shows that there was some farming going on. The big civilizations were the Mayas, Aztecs, Chibchas, and Incas. They existed from 2000 to 1500 BC. They were permanent farming towns in Mexico. And once they settled from hunting and gathering, they settled into villages. They were allowed to establish religion, arts and crafts, science, and especially war. They were very big on war. The Mesoamericans, these were the people who lived in Mexico and Central America, had densely populated cities. They had pyramids and villages. So the Mayans were very big on mathematics and astronomy. They had a calendar that was more accurate than the European calendar. Said the world would end in 2012, and it didn't. But the culture collapsed because they overexploited the rainforest, and there's also a lot of deforestation. They had a lot of civil wars. There was overpopulation, and they were overtaken by the Toltecs, who were a warlike people, and so the Mayans kind of disappeared. And the next big group of people were the Aztecs. Their capital was Tenochtitlan, and there were over 5 million people there. Some estimates are as high as 20 million people, though. There's the Chibchas. The book doesn't really say anything about them. Then there's the Quechuas, and they're better known for their name as the Incas. They lived from Ecuador to Chile along the Andes Mountains. They had a lot of roads, and they had an autocratic government, which is kind of unique for the time. Indian cultures of North America. They weren't as developed as the southern Indians like the Aztecs and the Mayans, but they still had war, and they had a pretty unified religious belief of sacredness of nature and community living and respecting their elders. There's estimated to be 240 tribes. They're broken down into 3 separate groups. This was the northern Indians. There's the Adena Hopewell culture. They lived in the Ohio River Valley. They had really extensive burial mounds. They were hunters and gatherers. They had a complex social structure and an elaborate trade network. And there's the Mississippi culture, and they were southeastern Mississippi. They were in the southeast America on the Mississippi River Valley. They were similar to the Mayans and Aztecs because they had an agricultural economy. They grew corn, beans, and squash. Their towns were built around plazas or temples, just like the Mayans and Aztecs. They had a complex social structure. And then we have the Hoekema Anasai. They lived in Southwest America. Their big focus was irrigation systems for agriculture, and they lived in cliffs, and they still do, and they're known as pueblos. Like the remaining ones, I don't know. The book was kind of weird about that. They didn't really have a rigid class structure, and they only used warfare to defend themselves. North America in 1500, Northern Indians had 3 subdivisions. There's the Eastern Woodlands tribes. And they lived along rivers and forests. They lived from New England to the Great Lakes to the Carolinas, so they were pretty much all along the East Coast and a bit inland. They did a bunch of stuff from fishing in canoes. They had wigwams. They grew corn. Some of these tribes were patriarchs and some were matriarchs, and that was because a lot of the times the men would go off hunting, and so the women would have to be in charge of a lot of like religious ceremonies and running the villages. Then there's the Great Plains tribes, and they were westward of the Mississippi. They were nomadic because they hunted bison. They would sometimes grow corn. Then we had the western tribes who lived on the Pacific coast and the west coast, and they did fishing, sealing, and whaling. And all these tribes, the western Great Plains and eastern woodlands, believed in the sacredness of nature, so that was a unified religious belief. So, European visions of America, so Europe had a lot of nautical technology, so that kind of allowed them to get to America. But the Vikings came to America first, and they explored North Africa, Russia, and Turkey also, so they were big explorers, and they also explored Iceland and Ireland. Eric the Red, he was a Viking, he colonized in Greenland, and then we have Leif Erikson, who was Eric the Red's son. He colonized Newfoundland in Canada, but the natives were really hostile, so that's why the Vikings left there, so that's why the Vikings didn't stay. The expansion of Europe, it was made possible by nautical technology, better ships, better navigational techniques, better maps, and powerful weapons. The Europeans just wanted riches from India and Asia, and they also wanted to spread Christianity. So there was a growth in trade, towns, corporations, and science. So the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation were also things that helped expand Europe, and we get into that later about how those two reformations helped expand Europe. The Renaissance geography. So the Renaissance occurs in Europe. Hopefully, we all know what that was. And one of the main things that happened in the Renaissance was that everyone knew that the world was round, and that's kind of like a myth, or a common misconception that Columbus was trying to sail to prove that the world was round, not flat, but everyone knew it was round, so that wasn't really a big deal. They used science and astronomy from the Renaissance for better navigation techniques. The growth of trade, towns, and nation-states. Since there was a lot of trade interest, there was a lot of exploration interest, because to trade you need to move, and to find new ways to move you have to explore. So Asia had stuff that Europe wanted, and if they traveled by land, then they had to pay taxes to the middlemen who were in the Middle East. And so Christians who go through Muslim lands trading, that's not a very good thing. To really kind of radical religions clashing. But as nations grow, like Spain and England and all those nations, the kings and queens are more powerful and they have more money, so they can invest in exploration. And the Crusades allowed Europeans to discover the Middle East, and that's how that whole trade thing happened. So that book kind of backtracks there. There are a lot of powerful European nations like Spain, France, England, and Portugal. The Spanish monarchs were Ferdinand and Isabella, and they were Crusade expansionists, and they made Spain Catholic. That's what being a Crusade expansionist is. They made it Catholic, so they got rid of all the Muslims and Jews there. The voyages of Columbus. So the Portuguese were leading the age of exploration, and they mapped out the whole entire West African coast. And while that was happening, Christopher Columbus was learning seamanship in a Portuguese school, but he was born in Italy, and his main goal was he wanted to spread Christianity and reach Asia by sailing west, because everyone was trying to go around Africa, which wasn't going to work. So he said, why don't we go west, because he didn't know that there was a huge continent in the way. So he got funding from Isabella and Ferdinand, and he had ships called the Santa Maria Pinta Nina, and I'm pretty sure the Mayflower's in there, but the book didn't talk about it, which kind of confused me. But Columbus reached the Bahamian islands of San Salvador, and he kept on going west when he got there. And once he got to the island of Hispaniola, he discovered gold and tobacco. So he went back to Europe with 40 men. He left 40 men in America, and he captured 15 Indians to present to the king and queen. He got a hero's welcome, and the Pope gave Spain right to the New World to convert the Indians to Catholicism. They were like, oh yeah, like, since you found it, like, it's yours, as long as you convert them to Catholicism. Christopher Columbus was like, yeah, I'll do that. And then there's kind of some, like, controversy with this, though, and so with the Treaty of Tordesillas, Portugal and Spain settled their land disputes, because Portugal was like, oh, well, Columbus learned from us, and Spain was like, yeah, but we funded him, and it was just like a big mess, and so they settled that with the treaty. But then when Columbus returned to where he left his men, there was chaos, and his men were raping Indians, so the Indians retaliated by killing his men, and so Columbus retaliates at the Indians for killing his men for raping their people. On his third voyage because he went to America, left some men, took some Indians, went back to Europe, came back, found all this chaos, killed a bunch of Indians, went back, then he came back a third time. He found Trinidad and the northern coast of South America. Then on his fourth and final voyage, he was still looking for Asia, so he would reach all these islands and be like, oh yeah, but like Asia, China has to be like right around here, so he would keep going west, and he found Jamaica, and he died thinking that he had found Asia. He thought Jamaica was Asia, which it's not. And then Amerigo Vespucci was Italian, and he's the one who said, you know what, this isn't Asia, Christopher Columbus is wrong, it's so big, it's a new continent, and since he didn't claim it for himself, he thought it was named Asia, I'm going to name it America. The Great Biological Exchange. Indians, Europeans, and Africans were exchanging religion, languages, food, and dress, even though pretty much the Europeans were forcing it on the Indians and Africans, but they still took some stuff here and there. There are a lot of new animals for the Americans, or for the Europeans. They were discovering all these animals in America that they had never seen before. There are also a lot of plants they hadn't seen before, like corn, potatoes, and beans. Well, certain types of beans. There was a population explosion in Europe and Asia because of all these new things. But in America, infectious disease like smallpox killed the Indians, and the Indian chiefs couldn't explain why there were all these diseases, and so that kind of upset the social structure of Indian villages. 8 million Indians died because of disease, and that's a third of the Indian population. Professional explorers. So Europeans were looking for a path through America to Asia, and John Cabot of England colonized North America in Canada, but England had other troubles at home, so even though England was like settling in America, they were like, you know what, we have to like fix our stuff at home right now, so we won't worry about America as much. But Vasco Nunez of Spain crossed the Isthmus of Panama on foot, so he was the first person to see the Pacific coast. He was the first European to see the Pacific Ocean from America. And then Ferdinand Magellan sailed around South America to Guam and the Philippines. The Spanish Empire. During the 16th century, Spain made the world's most powerful empire by colonizing in the Americas and converting the inhabitants to Christianity via missions. And these missions were based on finding gold and converting them to Christianity. There's a clash of cultures. Europeans had advanced ships and weapons, and the horses scared the Indians. So in this section, it basically said the Indians were scared of the Europeans, and the Europeans were going to take them over. Cortez's conquest, it began on February 18, 1519, with Hernan Cortez. He defeated the Tlaxcala, and this was a confederacy of 4 small kingdoms, Indian kingdoms, who opposed the Aztecs. So all the people who didn't die, Cortez was like, you know what, you can join me in my conquest against the Aztecs. And they're like, oh yeah, we don't like the Aztecs, we'll join you. And it was just a fun time, I guess. And so Cortez's soldiers were called the conquistadors, not the Indians, but his actual soldiers he brought from Spain. They didn't receive any pay, but he said that any gold they found, they were considered investors in this expedition. So any gold and like goods they found and slaves that they captured, they would have some part in it. Okay, so the Aztecs. The book like freaked out and was like, the Aztecs should be called the Mexica because that's like their formal name or something, but whatever. Their capital was Tenochtitlan. They were settled in Mexico City. They're very warlike people. They focused on capturing instead of killing because their people they captured could be used as slaves and sacrifices. The Aztecs had laws, science, farming, and engineering. And the engineering was like, not like engineering we see today, but like engineering pyramids. Their social elite were the nobles, or like the leaders, and they were considered gods and also war heroes. Aztec religion, their gods were based on nature and astronomy, so they had like a sun god, a sky god, and they believed in 3 layers of living. There was heaven, which was inaccessible to humans. There was earth, where the humans lived, and then there's the underworld, which is where the dead people went, or the souls of the dead went. And to please the gods in the heavens, they would sacrifice a lot of people. And when the Europeans saw this, they were disgusted, but then the book says that they shouldn't have been because the Europeans were torturing criminals at home, even worse than how the Aztecs were torturing their sacrifices. Invading Spaniards. Cortez entered the Aztec city peacefully, and he made Montezuma his puppet. He was like, oh, do this, and Montezuma II did all that because he thought that Cortez was a god, and the fact that he was on a horse like freaked Montezuma out, and he was like, oh, he's on a horse, so he must be a god. And so then Cortez takes all the gold and silver from the Aztecs, then he uses the Aztecs as labor for mines for silver and gold. So the Aztecs don't like this, so they kill Montezuma II because they think he's a traitor, and then they attack Cortez, and Cortez didn't expect this at all, and he lost a third of his men. So Cortez fled, and then he regrouped with the Tlaxcala, who he set up the agreement with before, and together they held an 85-day siege, and a lot of the Aztecs died because of smallpox. So he conquered the Aztecs, and he became the Aztec ruler. And this set the precedent for conquistadors, and it basically set. And so some things that happened after it were the conquer of the Yucatan Peninsula and Guatemala. Then Cortez did those, and then Francisco Pizarro conquered the Incas. Okay, Spanish America. They set up this thing called encomienda, and it basically said that officers of the army, of Cortez's army, got land and were put in charge of Indian villages. And these officers were called encomenderos, and their job was to protect and care for the village, and they had to protect and support the Catholic priests in their effort to convert the Indians. And the Indians provided goods and labors for the encomenderos, and a lot of Indians died from diseases like smallpox, so a lot of Africans were brought in to provide labor. Catholic missionaries decided that they can only convert the natives by force, and one Catholic missionary, Bartolomé de las Casas, he was a Cuban priest, denounced this forceful conversion, and the book makes a big deal out of it, even though it's really not. But Spanish exploration in North America, so they called North America New Spain instead of the New World. Encomendia allowed for haciendas to sprout, or they were big farms or ranches. The Spanish government was very involved in everything that was going on. Instead of kind of letting Cortez do whatever he wanted, they're like, no, we're going to keep an eye on everything, which is kind of the opposite of what the Spanish do later. The Spanish are #winning because England and France are having civil disputes back home, so they can't really focus on colonizing in America. So Spain just kind of, because they had already they already have religious uniformity because they kicked out all the Muslims and Jews. There are a lot of Spanish influences in America today, like a bajillion of our cities are named after Spanish people. They explored South America, Central America, South of North America, like Alabama and Florida. And North American colonies were built as a defensive buffer against France and England in case they do decide to colonize. Then if they tried to attack Spain, they couldn't, because there was in northern America, like in Florida and Alabama, there were already some colonies that weren't very well populated, but still they acted as a buffer. The Spanish Southwest, these were settlements in New Mexico, Texas, and California, and Catholic missions were secularized after 10 years. So if there was a mission and Indians were peaceful for 10 years, then the missions would divide the land among the Indians. They would all get Spanish citizenship, which unfortunately meant they also had to pay taxes. But then the missions, which were now ruled by the Indians, who agreed to be Catholic, had soldiers that protected them, and they lived in presidios or forts a bit. Probably they were like adjacent to the missions. Okay, so the missions were ruthless though, and they were very harsh with their conversions. There was no gold or silver jackpots in Mexico like the Spanish were hoping there would be, and there were a lot of Indian uprisings like the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, and it drove Spaniards from New Mexico. And so that was kind of and the book says that was the biggest Indian success that they've had against European forces. Horses and the Great Plains. In the Pueblo Revolt, Indians had a lot of time to steal horses. The horses were a lot better than the dogs that they used to use. And this started a horse trade between Indians, even though they already had a really extensive trade route. And it made bison hunting a lot easier. But with horses, the Indians could travel more, which means that disease traveled with them more. So it kind of didn't help them that much. The Protestant Reformation. So religion was a center of European life, and Protestants and Catholics fought a lot, and Martin Luther made Lutheranism, and there are all these different branches of Lutheranism, like Calvinism, and Calvinists were Swiss Protestants, and they believed in predestination, and the book is and because of this it affected America, even though it doesn't really say how it affected America. The Reformation in England. So King Henry was Catholic in England, but he decided to become Protestant because his wife didn't produce a male heir. And so he tried to divorce her, and then the Pope was like, no, you can't do that because you're Catholic. He was like, fine, I'm going to become Protestant then. And so with his new wife, he didn't get a male heir either, which is kind of funny. But his daughter was named Elizabeth, and she was a Protestant, and the Calvinists supported the purification of the Anglican Church, and these were known as Puritans, because Elizabeth was like, okay, England's not Anglican or Catholic. Well, we're changing Anglicans to be Protestant instead of Catholic like they were, and so Calvinists supported this, and they were called Puritans, the Calvinists who did. But then the people who were like, you know what, it was Catholic at one point, I don't like it either way, they were called Separatists. One more page, yay. Challenges to the Spanish Empire. The French were colonizing in Canada and New York, and the Netherlands gained independence from Spain, so now Spain was having trouble at home, which was kind of keeping the French and English from colonizing in America in the first place. Now the Spanish are kind of getting a little taste of that. And English explorers were making it all the way around the world. They went all the way around South Africa to Asia, and then South America to Asia, around South Africa back to England, which was a huge deal. And Queen Elizabeth was encouraging English pirates to attack the Spanish. Okay, the defeat of the Armada. Catholic Mary, who is Elizabeth's older sister, returned to England and was like, you know what, I deserve the throne. And Elizabeth was like, nope, and killed her. And so the Catholic Spanish King Philip was angry because England was going to become Catholic, but then the Queen was like, no, Protestant, and he was all angry. And so the Spanish Armada attacked England, and the Spanish Armada was huge, and it was like a legend, and it was supposed to be amazing. But then there was a huge storm on the coast of England, and it defeated the Armada. And the British also had a pretty good naval system, so they got naval supremacy instead of the Spanish, which was a big deal. Okay, English exploration. So now the English are finally starting to explore. Sir Humphrey Gilbert got funding from the British monarchs to explore, and he said that any colonies that would be set up would be subject to English laws. But then Gilbert disappeared on his expedition, which kind of sucked. Then, Raleigh's lost colony. Sir Walter Raleigh, who was actually the half-brother or step-brother of Gilbert, I think it was half-brother, got permission, or he got funding for a trip, and so he established Roanoke in North Carolina, and the governor of this colony was John White. And so both Raleigh and White go back to England for business reasons or something, like to go see the Queen. And then when they come back, the colony disappeared and it kind of sucked. And that's the end of the first chapter outline.